The judge tapped his gavel, silencing the courtroom. A confident prosecutor stepped forward, ready to destroy the black woman standing before him. But as she adjusted her suit and finally spoke, the entire court realized they had just walked into a nightmare of their own making. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension, the kind that hung heavy in the air before a storm. Rows of spectators whispered among themselves, eyes flickering toward the woman seated at the defense table. She was composed, unnervingly so. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, her posture was impeccable, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she looked like any other defendant, a woman caught in the unforgiving grip of the legal system. No family, no friends in the gallery, no expensive lawyer sitting beside her, just a court-appointed attorney who barely acknowledged her presence. That alone told the room everything they thought they needed to know about her. She was no one. The prosecutor, a tall man with slicked-back hair and an air of practiced confidence, smirked as he reviewed his notes. He had handled dozens of cases like this before. Routine, predictable, effortless. Women like her never walked out of his courtroom unscathed. He had built his reputation on taking people like her down. A clerk shuffled through paperwork, pausing as he glanced at the defendant's name on the case file. His brow furrowed slightly. Something about it felt off. Familiar, perhaps. But before he could dwell on it, the judge entered, and the courtroom rose in unison. The moment passed unnoticed, lost in the routine of judicial proceedings. From the prosecutor's table, a junior attorney leaned in toward her superior, whispering something about the defendant's background. The lead prosecutor waved him off dismissively. He didn't need a history lesson. He needed a conviction. Whatever this woman had done, whatever she claimed to be, it didn't matter. He was about to put her in her place. Meanwhile, a court officer stationed by the door found himself glancing at the woman more than once. There was something unusual about her demeanor. Most defendants fidgeted, showed signs of anxiety. Some sat in tight-lipped defiance, others with slumped shoulders in resignation. But not her. She was calm. Too calm. It wasn't just confidence. It was something else. Then, there was the way she carried herself, the subtle control in her movements, the way she adjusted her sleeves with precision, as if she had done it 1,000 times in boardrooms, not courtrooms. It was a simple gesture, one no one else seemed to notice, but to him, it spoke volumes. Still, no one questioned it. No one looked deeper. To them, she was just another black woman who had finally run out of luck. The prosecutor rose to his feet, buttoning his suit with a practiced motion. He walked toward the jury with slow, deliberate steps, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build tension. Then, he turned sharply toward the defendant, his lips curling into a smirk. "This case," he began, voice dripping with condescension, "is about accountability. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter how high they think they stand, is above the law." A few members of the jury nodded, buying into the performance. He had them right where he wanted them. He pivoted to face the woman at the defense table. "Miss Davis," he said, drawing out her name like an insult. Or should I say, former government employee. The words hung in the air, baited, waiting for a reaction. But the woman didn't flinch. The prosecutor took a step closer, tilting his head. "You must have thought your connections, your past titles, would protect you. That you could bend the rules and walk away without consequence. That people like me wouldn't see right through you." His eyes flickered toward the jury, playing to the crowd. He was building a story, one where she was a fraud, a liar, a woman who had tricked her way into power and was now facing justice. But she still didn't react. Her silence only fueled his arrogance. You sit there, silent, acting as if this isn't happening. But let me be clear. You will answer for what you've done, he continued, his voice rising. This courtroom isn't the Pentagon. There are no secret back channels to save you here. No classified files to hide behind. Just the law. And today, it will hold you accountable. From the jury box, one of the jurors, a man in his late 50s, shifted uncomfortably. Something about the prosecutor's confidence seemed too rehearsed, too eager. But he didn't say anything. No one did. Then, with a dramatic flourish, the prosecutor picked up a file from his table. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, flipping through the pages with exaggerated precision. The evidence against Miss Davis is overwhelming. She has deliberately obstructed justice, abused her so-called authority, and defied legal orders. And worst of all, he let the question linger, glancing toward the jury. She refuses to take responsibility. Again, nothing. She simply watched. A flicker of something crossed the prosecutor's face. Irritation. He had expected her to react, to stammer, to show fear, to at least shift in her chair. But she remained still, her gaze unwavering. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and then, in a final attempt to shatter her composure, he leaned forward, palms flat on the defense table. His voice dropped into something quieter, almost mocking. So, tell me, Miss Davis, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Who are you, really? He expected hesitation, maybe even a desperate attempt to explain herself. Instead, she met his gaze for the first time since the trial began. And she smiled. A small, knowing smile. The prosecutor stiffened. It was the kind of smile that said he had just walked straight into a trap. The prosecutor's smirk flickered, but he recovered quickly. He had spent years dismantling defendants in court, turning arrogance into humiliation. This woman would be no different. I see, he said, straightening his tie, masking his discomfort. You find this funny? The woman, Miss Davis, tilted her head slightly, the corners of her lips still curved in that infuriatingly calm smile. Not at all, she replied, voice smooth, controlled. I just find it interesting. Her tone was measured, but something about it sent a ripple of unease through the room. The prosecutor scoffed, shaking his head, as if dealing with a delusional defendant. Interesting. You're facing serious charges, Miss Davis. This is a courtroom, not some strategy meeting at the Pentagon. A murmur ran through the spectators, a wave of subtle tension rolling over them. The prosecutor was playing it off, but some people were starting to sense it. The shift. The imbalance in power that wasn't supposed to exist in this room. Since you seem to be in such good spirits, the prosecutor continued, his voice tightening, why don't you enlighten us? Tell us exactly what's so interesting about being on trial for obstruction of justice. Miss Davis exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't lean forward like a cornered defendant pleading her case. She didn't stammer or hesitate. Instead, she sat back, completely composed. It's interesting, she said, how convinced you are that you're in control of this situation. A silence fell over the room. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Miss Davis turned slightly in her chair, as if getting more comfortable. You came in here so sure of yourself, so sure of me. She gestured vaguely around the room. Everyone in this courtroom did. They saw what you wanted them to see. A black woman alone at the defendant's table. No high-priced lawyer. No family. A woman whose power has already been stripped away. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor forced a chuckle. I don't need to assume anything, Miss Davis. The evidence was handed to you. she cut in smoothly. Neatly packaged, tied up with a bow. You never questioned it. Never questioned why this case landed in your lap. She leaned forward, finally engaging. But tell me, counselor, did you ever ask yourself why I never fought back? That stopped him. The prosecutor hesitated just long enough for the tension in the room to thicken. He hadn't expected her to take this angle. Defendants either crumbled under his pressure or lashed out in a way that played right into his hands. But she was doing neither. One of the junior attorneys at the prosecution table shifted, glancing down at the file again, suddenly less sure of what he was looking at. The judge cleared his throat. Miss Davis, he said sternly, if you have something relevant to say, I suggest you get to the point. Miss Davis turned toward him. I already have, Your Honor. Another ripple of unease ran through the room. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her leather-bound folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the defense table, sliding it forward with her fingertips. The prosecutor scoffed. What's this? A last-minute plea for mercy? Miss Davis didn't answer. She simply waited. The prosecutor rolled his eyes and grabbed the document, glancing over it with the same dismissive arrogance he had carried since the trial began. But the moment his eyes settled on the first line, the color drained from his face. His fingers tightened around the paper. The courtroom watched, waiting. He swallowed, read it again. Then, without a word, he turned and walked stiffly back to his table, his movements mechanical. He handed the document to his co-counsel without meeting his eyes. The younger attorney took it, scanned the contents, then immediately sat up straighter, his face paling. Across the room, a court officer caught a glimpse of the heading on the paper and stiffened. His entire demeanor shifted as he exchanged a glance with another officer by the door. The judge frowned. What exactly is going on? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Miss Davis, and for the first time that day, his confidence cracked. She simply smiled, because at that moment, the entire courtroom was beginning to realize what she had known all along. This was never her trial. It was theirs. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom. The prosecutor stood frozen, staring at the document in his trembling hands. His face, once brimming with confidence, was now pale with realization. His lips parted, but no words came out. The judge's patience wore thin. "Counselor," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "I asked you a question. What is going on?" The prosecutor didn't answer. He was still processing what he had just read. His hands clenched the paper, as if he could crush the truth out of it. Miss Davis sat motionless, waiting. Not pressing, not gloating, just letting the weight of the moment settle on everyone in the room. Finally, the judge grew impatient. "Let me see that," he demanded. The prosecutor hesitated, then slowly stepped forward and handed the document to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanned the paper, and stopped. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the edges. Then, he looked up. And for the first time since the trial began, he looked at Miss Davis not as a defendant, but as someone far, far above his station. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People fidgeted, eyes darting between Miss Davis and the now visibly shaken judge. Even the jury, who had been so easily swayed before, were beginning to sense something was terribly wrong, but not with her. The prosecutor cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. This changes nothing," he stammered, though even he didn't believe it. She's still on trial." Miss Davis finally moved. She leaned forward, lacing her fingers together on the table, her gaze sharp but composed. "Am I?" Her voice was steady, but the question landed like a hammer. The prosecutor felt his control slipping. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this woman." The judge held up a hand, cutting him off. His face was unreadable now, but his voice was firm. "Mr. Calloway, I suggest you tread very carefully." That was it. That single sentence shattered the prosecutor's entire facade. Because it wasn't just a warning. It was a lifeline. And he had been too arrogant to realize he needed one. The judge turned his gaze back to Miss Davis. He studied her for a long moment, before carefully placing the document down in front of him, smoothing the edges like something sacred had just landed on his desk. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. The spectators were on edge, waiting for someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. Miss Davis tilted her head slightly. "Do you still want to ask me who I am?" The prosecutor swallowed hard. He didn't dare answer, because now he knew. And so did everyone else. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The once confident prosecutor now stood motionless, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching at his sides. The weight of his mistake bore down on him, visible in the way his shoulders sagged, in the way his jaw clenched, like he was holding back the urge to disappear. The judge exhaled slowly, choosing his next words with care. He lifted the document one final time, running his fingers over the Pentagon seal embossed at the top. It wasn't just a title. It was authority. It was power beyond anything anyone in this room had imagined. "Case dismissed," the judge declared, his voice calm but absolute. The words rang out like a gavel strike to the prosecutor's career. A murmur swept through the spectators, a low hum of disbelief and realization. The court officer who had sensed something earlier now stood at attention, eyes locked on Miss Davis with newfound respect. The prosecutor opened his mouth, desperation flickering in his expression. "Your Honor, But the judge didn't even look at him. His gaze remained on Miss Davis. A silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the power dynamic that had always been there, even if no one had seen it until now. Miss Davis pushed back her chair and stood. The room reacted immediately. The jurors, once so certain of her guilt, now sat frozen, processing the shift. The spectators who had whispered about her downfall now whispered about how close they had been to making a grave mistake. The prosecutor, now visibly shaken, took an unconscious step back. Miss Davis didn't gloat, didn't revel in his humiliation. She simply straightened her suit, adjusted her cuffs with precision, and turned toward the door. The case was over, but for the man who had tried to bring her down, the consequences were just beginning. Miss Davis walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor, the sound echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. No one stopped her. No one dared. As she reached the doors, she paused, not out of hesitation, but to glance over her shoulder one last time. The prosecutor, still standing in shock, met her gaze. His face, once smug and full of certainty, now bore the weight of a man who had just realized he had been playing the wrong game all along. Miss Davis gave him nothing, no words, no parting glance of pity or triumph, just a slight knowing smile. And then she was gone. The courtroom remained frozen for a moment longer before the murmurs began again, louder this time. People whispering, questioning, trying to understand how they had misjudged her so completely. The jurors looked at one another, the weight of their nearly disastrous verdict settling in. Outside, the sun was bright, unbothered by what had just unfolded inside. Miss Davis stepped into the light, adjusted her suit, and disappeared into the city. Somewhere in that courtroom, Someone was still asking the question, who was she really? But the truth was simple. She had always been exactly who she said she was. They just hadn't been ready to see it. What do you think? If you were in that courtroom, would you have judged her the same way? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you think twice about the way we perceive power, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's always more to the story than what meets the eye.